everybody, Jan of Jan Hicks Creates here, coming back at you with lesson number 6 of my Basics of Cross Stitch series. I'll get that. Today we are going to talk about variegated floss, how to use it, what it looks like, the kind of all the different things that are called variegated floss. They don't look the same. Some don't look variegated at all. Variegated over dyed are kind of interchangeable words. But I have several samples here to show you kind of what the gamut is of variegated, and then some samples of the stitching and the different ways you can stitch with that floss to get different effects. And it is up to you in the creative process to decide which one you like the best, which one you want to use for one project, and you may change it for a different project. Now, when I say variegated floss, I'm talking about everything from cotton to silk to if there's wool over dyed, anything that has a variegation that you would stitch with, these rules will basically apply. So I'm going to turn you around here so you're looking down at my work table, and we'll get started. All right, so I have everything set up that I want to talk to you about today. And what we're going to talk about is the different types of variegation. And by that I mean greater or less, basically. More colors or fewer colors. And we're going to go, I kind of messed up the order a bit of the way I wanted to talk because I added some things, but I want to start here and go this way and talk about more or less. So there are many skeins out there, many over-dyed flosses, like these two, that are less. So if you look at this, and I do have my aught light turned on so that we can get some good light, hopefully some good clear light on what I'm showing you. So this is Genoart's Claret sampler threads. And if you look at this, there is not a whole lot of variegation, relatively speaking. You can see maybe some darker places and some lighter places, but overall it's hard to see a whole lot of variegation. This is called tonal. It is basically the same tone, the same color, just lighter and darker tones of that color. You see the dark in there and the light in there. But overall, when you stitch with this, there isn't a whole lot of color change. Again, relatively speaking. The same with this one. This is Victorian Motto Sampler Shop's Special Orchid. This is one of the limited edition, one of the club skeins that I got. And again, you can see there's a range of light to dark purple. So there's some change, and there's actually more that you can see in the purple in the Special Orchid than you can see in the Claret. Overall, there's more change. Next, I have the Genoart's Poinsettia. And this is one where you can see a great deal of change. So you can see it kind of goes back and forth between the light and the dark. And so that is much clearer. It's still a tonal because it's still the same basic shade, but much more striking difference between the light and the dark. This is Weeks Dye Works. Oops, where'd the tag go? This is Weeks Dye Works Meadow. And again, tonal, but getting a little bit away from tonal because the green, the olive green, and then this brighter kind of, boy, I don't even know what to call that. They're not exactly the same shade, the same tone. There's more blue in one and more yellow in the other. Again, with this is, oh, forgot to get the, This is the Gentle Art Blueberry. And this is getting even more different. So you're going into kind of shades of gray, going back and forth between shades of gray and shades of blue. And then you have the very striking, this is Threadworks number 1044, a very striking variegated where there's different colors altogether. And so all of these are going to stitch up slightly differently, and I do have samples to show you of that. And then you have the silks. This is Mrs. Sada's Silk Darling, where you have it goes back and forth between the greens and the blues. And then again, a highly variegated popcorn, Mrs. Sada's Popcorn. And I'll be talking about those at the end and how I use those. One of the ways you can use them. So whenever you are stitching with these, whenever it calls for these, you can certainly just do it the standard way. And the standard way to stitch with variegated floss is one stitch at a time. It is not necessarily the fastest or the easiest way to stitch. So I wanted to show you samples of how the different flosses will look depending on how you're stitching with them. And I have kind of a cheat sheet here of what I've done. So the first block, this is Claret here. So this is the one that has, you know, it has some light and dark. And I actually am seeing it more now on the camera than I could see in real life. But I stitched with that in this first section. And in my opinion, the variegation does not show up hardly at all. So this first section is 2 strands, one at a time. So this is one at a time going vertically and one at a time going horizontally. And as I said, that is the general way, the standard way to stitch with variegated floss. And again, you really can't see much of the variation. Now, there are no cross-stitch police. You do not have to stitch that way. So the second chunk is, again, 2 strands held together, out and back. So half the leg done going out, going to the right, and then finishing the cross coming back. And then the second row going out and coming back. And in my opinion, that's not very different from the first one, single stitch at a time. The next chunk, I took 1 strand and folded it in half so I could do the loop method. And so I could see if there was much difference in doing the loop method. And as you can see, there really isn't. And again, and that is 1 stitch at a time. And then this is out and back. So half the leg across the row, this finishing the X coming back across the row. So 1 stitch at a time going across the row here, dropping down to the next row, 1 stitch at a time coming back, 1 stitch at a time going across. And then down here, half the leg, half the stitch across the row, half the stitch coming back, half the stitch across the row, half the stitch coming back. So with that particular floss, you can see, I think, a little bit of the change up here at the top, but not a whole lot. So this is where, when I pick up this floss, a chart has called for this floss and I'm getting ready to use it, I decide, is it worth the effort to do 1 stitch at a time, or should I just go ahead and do my half leg across and half leg back? For me, the majority of time when I'm using this type, I will do the half stitch across, half stitch back. So the next one, this is the Victorian motto, Special Orchid, where kind of the same tonal, but a stronger difference between the lights and the darks. And so the same thing. The first one, the first chunk is single stitch at a time, 2 strands held together, single stitch across the row and back, and then single stitch vertically up and down. And for this one, you definitely can see more of the variegation than you could in the claret. Second chunk is again 2 strands, but this is out and back. So half a leg done, going out across the row and finishing off the X coming back. Again, you can see the variegation in that. You can really see the tonal effect. The next chunk, taking 1 strand, folding it in half, and doing 1 stitch at a time. You can still kind of see a little bit of the variegation, but it is starting to blend in more, and even more so in the next chunk. 1 strand folded, out and back. So these two, it's really starting to blend much more than what you get up here. And then what I've done down here at the bottom is just created a chunk where I kind of, instead of doing the striping, a row out and a row back, where you get this striping, or up and down where you get striping, I did kind of meandering through this section so that the colors are kind of more in a more organic flow, not striped. All right, makes sense? So let's look at the next one. The next one I used was the Poinsettia, and that's the one where you do have the stronger variegation, the real light and the real dark. Now, again, same thing. Top chunk, 2 strands held together, single stitches across the row and back, or down and back. So this again is the more traditional way of using variegated floss, and you can really see how the dark portions stand out against the lighter portions. The next chunk, 2 strands again held together, but this time out and back. So out, half a stitch, back the other half. Drop down the next row, half a stitch, back. And you can see it's really starting to blend, and you're losing the strong differentiation in the color. It's almost looking muddy to me. It's definitely lost the strong variegation. The next one, 1 strand folded in half, a single stitch at a time across the row, and drop down a single stitch back. The next chunk, 1 strand folded in half, out and back. And that has pretty much lost all of the variegation. It's very much blended together. And then down here at the bottom, again, this chunk where it's 2 strands held together, and I'm kind of meandering around. You still get the strong difference in the variegation, but it's more organic than the stripes you would get up here. So let me pause there and talk about something else that has an effect. And there's really no way to control this for every chart, every floss, and that is the length that you have both in between the color change. So by that I mean you have, some dark red, and then some pink, and then it fades back to the dark red the whole way across the length. There's some kind of mottled darkish in there, lighter pink, before we get to a bigger section of darker pink. So you have that determines how this variegation works. You also have, of course, how many stitches you're doing in that section with that color. So if you're doing a bigger row, that color is going to play out differently than what I'm showing you here, right? So just all things to be aware of. Again, not necessarily something you would ever be able to control, but just to be aware of how the colors are going to play out, and to think about as you're starting to stitch how the colors will play out across any given section. So then let's turn to the very variegated one. This is the Threadworks one with all the different colors. And that one, so again, the top section is 2 strands held together, colors matching, single stitches across the row, single stitches coming back, across and back, and then single stitches up and down. Now you don't really get as much of the striping effect because you do have so many colors going on in this skein. You may get more if you have longer sections or shorter sections. Again, it's hard to determine. Second section is again 2 strands held together, out and back. So you can see the red underneath is the first leg, and then the green on the top is the second leg. Darker green on the bottom is the first leg, light green on the top is the section. And this, you know, I expected this portion to look more muddy as the colors blended, but I kind of think it's a cool look. It makes me think of filling in stitches when you're doing needlepoint or counted thread embroidery, specialty stitches. It kind of has that, I don't know, kind of like a filler type of look. I think it's kind of cool. The next one strand folded in half. Now the interesting thing about this particular floss is because of the way it was dyed, and of course I don't know for sure how they had the strands, the skein laid out to dye, but if you look at this, if I hold it, so this is Threadworks. They also have the pre-cut length, yard length, just like Gentle Arts. But if you look at this, you have the greens together, and then they fade to where it's orange and red, and then it fades back into the greens. And yeah, you have some dark green and light green, but it's still the greens and then the orange and the red. So when I held a length, took one length and folded it, it gave me this, the oranges together and the greens together. This is 1 stitch at a time, and this is out and back. So it still has that, you know, the colors together, which I thought was very interesting. And again, not every skein is going to work that way. You know, if you want to experiment, I highly encourage that before you start stitching. And then the bottom one was 2 strands held together, so the colors are matching up, just meandering through this section to get a nice broken, organic look to the colors. So I highly encourage you, whenever you get one of these skeins, especially one that's highly variegated like this, go ahead and open it up and lay out the strand and see how it's dyed, where the colors meet, how long the different colored lengths are, if you can do anything with those. And that will give you a better idea of how the colors are going to flow and maybe what manipulations you'd like to do to get them to look different, if that's the look you want. Now, I most often will do this. Well, let me back up. If I am using, as I mentioned, if I am using a thread that has this kind, very, very slight change in tonal variegation, I'll just do out and back, and I'll fold it in half, and I won't worry about it if I need 2 strands. Pretty much anything else, I'll use 2 strands, and I will do 1 stitch at a time. Now, where I would want the striping look would be on a roof of a house, on a house itself, and that could either be horizontal or vertical. On a tree trunk, I would want it vertical. That's the kind of thing you want to think about before you start stitching, whenever you have that variegated floss. Do I want to manipulate my floss to get a desired effect? And with variegated and over-dyed flosses, you can do that. But if I don't really want to have anything that's striping like this, then I'll more often do the kind of meandering organic look. And that's what has been so effective for my By the Bay pieces. So the sky is Kansas Sky by Victorian Motto Sampler Shop. Again, one of their monthly club colors. And the water is Coastal Seaweed, also by Victorian, with darker Peacock Elegance by XG Design. And you can see, because of the way I kind of wander around with my floss, I have all this wonderful, just organic, you don't really know where it's going to land, variegation. Now I will say, whenever I'm working with especially something like this that has the heavier variegation, if I'm coming, like over here, I was coming to the end of the green and started the red, and I could have continued around the outline to do the red, or I could have continued up here to do the red. Instead, I kind of came back on itself, so I would get a clump of red. And then I came up here and I did the orange, and I kind of kept the orange together until it started to change to the light green, and then I kind of came down here. So I do kind of watch where my floss is changing, what's coming up next, as I decide what direction I want to head to next. So there is some, I guess, planning on the go, I would say, that I do when I'm working with something like this, to kind of keep, because I didn't want like the lighter sections. I wanted the lighter sections to be enough together that you could see them. If I had just like strung them out along a section, they wouldn't have had as much impact because, you know, they're more spread out over the canvas, if you will. So a couple other things you can do with variegated floss to kind of control the colors a bit more is called color control. And so, for example, patchwork. With this piece, if you remember, I am working this as a rainbow. And so I have popcorn here. And popcorn, as you can see, is made up of both pinks and blues. I really just wanted to concentrate on the pinks in this section because this was my transition from kind of the reds into the pinks. And so as I was working with it, I would cut off what I needed. So here's a section that's all the blue. I would just cut that off here and set that section aside. And then I pull out the next section where the pinks are, and keep going until I get to where the blue starts again, which is the whole way over here. So that's quite a big section, so I would pull that out and then cut it in half and work with the pinks. And that way, and then the blues I'm going to save for later in the piece when I start transitioning to the blues. And so you can see I have one of those pieces already saved off here. The other place that I'm working that way is shades of gold. And so if you are familiar with this with me, this is the one where I am, there's two colors in this, two shades of gold, funnily enough, in this pattern. I am using Mrs. Sadis's Darling Floss, and it has strong enough variations in the blues. You can see this tends, the right hand is more royal and the left hand is more green. So I go through my skeins. When I'm done with one, I'll open up the next one and start going through it and cut it apart so that I have the ones that are more blue and the ones that are more green already set to work with. Now, I highly recommend, if you are going to do this, do it in good light, especially something that has this kind of really close colors, to make sure that you are cutting them off in the correct place. And then you can work with them and get this kind of subtle yet obvious color manipulation. So that is pretty much all that I have for you. I encourage you to experiment. I'm actually thinking that I might cut out these little swatches and stick them in the bags with the floss so that I have them ready so that I can see exactly how the colors play out. And that helps me make my decision. So if I pull this out, I can say, yeah, not enough difference there. I'm just going to do it like use it like normal floss. I like the idea of doing this for all my over dyed, and then I laugh at myself because that's just an awful lot of work. But yeah, I may keep that handy with what I've done so far. Anyways, I hope you have found this helpful. As always, let me know if you have any questions. I will be doing a video on how to handle silks next. Now, I do have one already that I may just repurpose, and that would be good to go up next week since it's kind of in between Christmas and New Year, and I wouldn't have to do a new one. But we shall see. I may feel that that one isn't adequate and I need to add something to it. So I hope you guys have a wonderful week, and I will talk to you next time. Bye-bye.